The morning sun was shining bright over Seoul Military Base when Commander Hyun-woo received the call that would change everything for Earth and humanity. His phone rang at exactly 0600 hours, and the voice on the other end was shaking with excitement and fear. The caller was General Park, who told him that contact had finally been made with beings from outer space. Hyun-woo had served as a Navy SEAL for 15 years and had seen combat in many dangerous places around the world. He was known for staying calm under pressure and never showing fear even when facing the most deadly enemies. But today, as he put on his dress uniform and prepared to meet these alien visitors, he felt something he had not experienced in many years. His heart was beating faster than normal, and his hands were slightly shaking as he adjusted his medals and ribbons. The base was buzzing with activity as soldiers and officers rushed around preparing for this historic moment. Lieutenant Ji-hoon, who had served with Hyun-woo on 3 combat deployments, was checking and rechecking his equipment, even though they were not expecting a fight. Captain So-young was organizing the female officers and making sure everyone looked their best for the first contact with an alien species. Dr. Yoon-ji was setting up medical equipment just in case the aliens had different biology that might cause problems. At exactly 1,000 hours, the sky began to darken as a massive ship appeared overhead. The vessel was unlike anything humans had ever built or imagined. It was at least 2 kilometers long and shaped like a giant triangle with smooth metal surfaces that seemed to shimmer and change color in the sunlight. Strange lights pulsed along its edges, and the air itself seemed to vibrate as the ship slowly descended toward the landing area that had been cleared for this moment. Hyun-woo stood at attention with his fellow officers as the ship touched down with surprising gentleness for something so massive. The ground barely shook and there was no sound of engines or thrusters. Lieutenant Tae-min whispered that it was like the ship was floating rather than flying. Sergeant Dong-hyun was recording everything with a small camera while trying to look professional and not show his amazement. A section of the ship's hull began to glow and then simply disappeared, leaving an opening large enough for vehicles to drive through. The humans waited in perfect formation as strange music began playing from inside the ship. It sounded like a combination of bells and drums, but with electronic sounds that Earth musicians had never created. The melody was both beautiful and slightly threatening at the same time. Then they appeared, and every human present had to fight to keep their professional composure. The aliens were enormous, standing at least 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long arms. They had 4 arms, instead of 2, and their skin was a deep blue color that seemed to have tiny lights moving underneath like stars in a night sky. Their heads were larger than human heads, with 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern and mouths that were wider than seemed possible. The leader of the group was even more impressive than the others. He wore armor that looked like it was made from liquid metal that constantly shifted and changed patterns. Golden symbols appeared and disappeared on the surface, and the whole suit seemed to glow with its own light. When he walked, his footsteps made no sound, despite his obvious weight and size. General Vextar was his name according to the translation device he carried. When he spoke, his voice was deep and powerful, like thunder rolling across mountains. The translator made his words sound like perfect English, but there was something strange about the rhythm and timing that reminded everyone this being was definitely not human. He looked down at the assembled humans with his 4 eyes moving independently to study each person. Hyun-woo felt like he was being examined by some kind of superior intelligence that could see things about him that he did not even know about himself. The alien's eyes lingered on his combat ribbons and scars before moving on to the next officer. The alien general began to speak, and his words were both exciting and insulting at the same time. He explained that Earth had been watched for many years by the Galactic Federation. They had observed human wars and conflicts and had decided that humans might be useful as soldiers in their vast armies that protected civilized worlds throughout the galaxy. However, he made it clear that this was not an invitation, but more like a test. Humans would have to prove they were worthy of joining the Federation as junior members. They would need to demonstrate strength, courage, and the ability to follow orders from superior beings who had been fighting galactic wars for thousands of years. Captain Zekmore, who stood behind the general, was clearly the military commander of this group. He was even larger than General Vextar and covered in scars that showed he had survived many battles. His forearms each carried different types of weapons, and his armor looked more practical and battle-worn than the general's ceremonial gear. When Zekmore looked at the human soldiers, his expression was one of barely hidden amusement. He pointed directly at Hyun-Woo with one of his four hands and said something in the alien language that made all the other aliens laugh. The translation device picked up his words as asking if this small creature was really supposed to be one of Earth's best warriors. The laughter of the aliens was like the sound of grinding metal mixed with the roar of wild animals. It echoed across the base and made some of the younger human soldiers step backward involuntarily. But Hyun-Woo noticed something important in that moment. He saw Lieutenant Min-Ah straighten her shoulders and lift her chin higher. He watched as Sergeant Dong-hyun clenched his fists and took a half step forward before remembering military discipline. The aliens had just made their first mistake, and Hyun-Woo could see it in the faces of every human present. By laughing at them and treating them like children or pets, the aliens had awakened something in the human soldiers that they probably should have left sleeping. Pride was a powerful force, and these beings from the stars had just wounded the pride of some of the most dangerous fighters Earth had ever produced. As the formal ceremony continued with speeches about honor and service to the greater galactic community, Hyun-Woo was already planning and thinking like the tactical expert he had trained to become. He was studying how the aliens moved and carried themselves, looking for weaknesses and advantages that might not be obvious at first glance. The day was just beginning, and already he could feel that this encounter was going to test everything. He had learned about warfare leadership and survival in ways he had never imagined possible. The next morning arrived with gray clouds covering the Seoul sky, as if even the weather knew something important was about to happen. Hyun-Woo woke up at 500 hours as he had done every day for the past 15 years, but today felt different. He could hear unusual sounds coming from outside his quarters. Metal clanging against metal and voices speaking in the alien language mixed with the familiar sounds of human soldiers preparing for training. When he stepped outside, he saw that the Velkari had been busy during the night. They had constructed a massive training area in the center of the base using materials and tools that seemed to appear from nowhere. The obstacle course they built was clearly designed for beings much larger and stronger than humans. The walls were twice as high as normal, and the gaps between platforms required jumps that would challenge even the most athletic human soldiers. Captain Zekmore was already there directing other Velkari soldiers as they set up equipment that looked both fascinating and terrifying. There were weights that appeared to be made from some kind of dense alien metal. When two Velkari soldiers lifted one of the smaller weights, it left deep impressions in the concrete where they set it down. Hyun-Woo estimated that the weight probably massed more than a small car. The combat ring was perhaps the most impressive and intimidating part of their setup. It was made from the same shimmering metal as their ship and seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The surface was perfectly smooth, but somehow provided traction for feet and hands. Strange symbols appeared and disappeared around the edges, and Hyun-Woo suspected the ring could do things that human technology could not match. Lieutenant Ji-hoon arrived at the training area with the other human soldiers and immediately began studying the alien equipment. His engineering background made him curious about how everything worked, but also worried about whether humans could safely use tools designed for such different physiology. Captain So-young was organizing the female officers and discussing strategy for how to approach the challenges they would face. General Vextar appeared at exactly 800 hours wearing different armor than the day before. This suit was more practical and showed signs of use in actual combat. He carried a device that projected his voice across the entire training area so every human could hear him clearly. His four eyes scanned the assembled soldiers with what appeared to be mild interest rather than respect. The general explained that the day would consist of various tests to measure human capabilities in areas that mattered for galactic warfare. Physical strength, endurance, combat skills, and most importantly, the ability to follow orders and work as part of a larger military structure. He made it clear that failure in these tests would mean Earth would not be invited to join the Federation as anything more than a protected species. Captain Zekmore stepped forward, and his massive presence made even the largest human soldiers look small by comparison. He began demonstrating the proper techniques for using the alien equipment, and his casual display of strength was both impressive and demoralizing. He lifted weights that no human could move and completed obstacle course, sections that seemed impossible for someone of his size. Then he called for volunteers to attempt the same challenges he had just demonstrated. Lieutenant Tae-min was the first to step forward. Despite being one of the younger officers, he had earned respect for his courage and fighting skills in previous missions. Hyun-woo felt proud of his subordinate, but also worried about what might happen when human limitations met alien expectations. Tae-min approached the weights first and managed to lift one of the smaller ones, though it was clearly requiring all of his strength. The Velkari soldiers made sounds that might have been approval or might have been amusement. It was difficult for the humans to read alien expressions and body language, but when Tae-min completed the lift without dropping the weight, several aliens nodded their large heads. The obstacle course was more challenging, and Tae-min had to use creativity and technique to overcome barriers designed for much larger beings. He rolled under gaps that the aliens simply stepped over and used momentum and timing to clear jumps that should have been impossible. By the time he finished the course, he was breathing hard and covered in sweat, but he had completed every section. Captain Zekmore seemed surprised that the human had managed to finish the course at all. He walked over to Tae-min and looked down at him with his four eyes, showing what might have been curiosity. Then, without warning, he gestured toward the combat ring and spoke in his own language. The translation device rendered his words as a challenge to test human fighting abilities against Velkari combat techniques. Tae-min looked back at Hyun-woo, who gave a small nod of permission. The young lieutenant knew he was probably outmatched, but also understood that someone had to show these aliens that humans would not back down from any challenge. He climbed into the ring and took a fighting stance that he had practiced thousands of times in training. Zekmore entered the ring with obvious confidence bordering on arrogance. His four arms moved independently as he warmed up, showing fighting techniques that no human had ever seen before. He could attack and defend from multiple angles simultaneously, and his reach advantage was enormous. When the bout began, it seemed like the outcome was predetermined, but Tae-min had advantages that the alien captain did not expect. Human fighting styles had been developed over thousands of years of warfare between beings of similar size and strength. Techniques like speed timing and misdirection were crucial when facing opponents who might be stronger or better armed. Tae-min used these skills to avoid the aliens' powerful strikes and land quick, precise hits to vulnerable points. For several minutes, the fight was closer than anyone had expected. Tae-min ducked and weaved around the aliens' forearms, landing strikes too, joints and nerve points that made Zekmore stumble and curse in his own language. The watching humans began to cheer as their representative showed that skill could compete with raw strength and size. Then Zekmore got angry and everything changed in an instant. His casual attitude disappeared and was replaced by the cold fury of a warrior who had conquered dozens of worlds. One of his massive hands caught Tae-min across the chest and sent the human flying backward to crash against the edge of the ring. The sound of the impact echoed across the training area, and Lieutenant Tae-min did not get up. Dr. Yoon-ji rushed forward to check on the injured soldier, while the Velkari aliens laughed with sounds like grinding machinery. Captain Zekmore stood, over the fallen human and made comments that the translation device barely bothered to render into polite language. The message was clear enough without translation. Humans were weak toys that broke easily when real warriors got serious about fighting. Hyun-woo helped Dr. Yoonji move Taemin to safety while keeping his face calm and professional. But inside, he was analyzing everything he had seen during the fight. The alien captain was strong and fast, but he had also revealed patterns and preferences that a careful observer could catalog and potentially exploit. The day was far from over, and Hyun-woo was already planning for what might come next. The afternoon sun was getting lower in the sky when the Valkyrie aliens began showing their true nature. What had started as testing and evaluation was slowly turning into something that looked more like entertainment for the alien soldiers. Captain Zekmore seemed especially pleased with himself after defeating Lieutenant Taemin and was walking around the training area like he owned everything and everyone on the base. Hyun-woo watched from his position with the other senior officers as the aliens began treating the human soldiers less like potential allies and more like amusing pets. They made jokes in their own language that the translation devices only partially converted, but the tone and body language made their meaning clear enough. These powerful beings from the stars thought humans were weak and probably not worth the effort of recruiting. General Vextar was reviewing data on a device that looked like a sheet of liquid metal with symbols flowing across its surface. He occasionally looked up to observe the human soldiers, and his 4 eyes showed what appeared to be disappointment rather than the curiosity he had displayed earlier. It was becoming obvious that the aliens had expected more from Earth's warriors and were finding the reality somewhat lacking. The Valkyrie soldiers who had accompanied their leaders were becoming more casual and disrespectful as the day progressed. They pushed past human soldiers without apology and handled human equipment roughly as if it were toys made for children. One alien picked up a standard military rifle and bent the barrel with casual pressure from 2 of his 4 hands before, tossing it aside like garbage. Lieutenant Ji-hoon was standing near the weapons display when this happened, and his face showed the anger that all the humans were feeling but trying to hide. These aliens were not just testing human capabilities anymore. They were deliberately showing contempt for human technology and, by extension, for humanity itself. The careful diplomacy of first contact was being replaced by something that felt more like bullying. Captain So Young was organizing a group of female officers for their turn at the physical challenges when one of the Valkyrie soldiers made a comment that the translation device rendered as questioning whether human females were actually soldiers or just present for decorative purposes. The alien found this hilarious and shared the joke with his companions, who responded with their grinding, metallic laughter. Dr. Yoonji was still checking on Lieutenant Taemin, who was conscious but clearly in pain from his encounter with Captain Zekmore. She was trying to keep her medical work professional and ignore the increasingly hostile atmosphere, but Hyun-woo could see the tension in her shoulders and the way she kept glancing toward the aliens with barely concealed anger. The breaking point came during what should have been a simple rest period between training exercises. Sergeant Dong-hyun was carrying water bottles to distribute among the human soldiers who had been working hard all day in the alien-designed challenges. He was walking carefully because his hands were full, and he was trying to avoid drawing attention from the increasingly arrogant aliens. Captain Zekmore was standing with 2 other Valkyrie warriors near the path that Dong-hyun needed to take. The alien captain saw the human approaching, and his 4 eyes gleamed with what was clearly malicious amusement. He said something to his companions that made them focus their attention on the approaching human soldier. As Sergeant Dong-hyun walked past the group of aliens, Captain Zekmore casually extended one of his massive legs directly into the human's path. Dong-hyun had no time to react or change direction. He hit the alien's leg at full stride and went down hard, spilling water everywhere and landing face first in the dirt with his uniform immediately soaked and muddy. The sound that came from the watching Valkyrie was not the polite laughter of beings enjoying harmless humor. It was the cruel amusement of bullies who had found a victim they could torment without consequences. Captain Zekmore looked down at the fallen human and made an exaggerated expression of surprise while speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. The translation device picked up his words as a mockery of human clumsiness and suggested that, perhaps, these small beings should be more careful when walking around their betters. He used a term that the translator rendered as something like pets or servant animals. The other aliens found this incredibly funny, and their laughter grew even louder and more cruel. Hyunwoo was moving toward his fallen soldier before he even realized he had taken the first step. His years of military training and combat experience were screaming warnings about maintaining diplomatic relations and avoiding incidents that could harm Earth's chances of joining the galactic community. But his deeper instincts as a leader and protector of his people were overriding those careful political considerations. He reached Sergeant Dong-hyun and helped the younger soldier to his feet, while keeping his face professionally neutral despite the rage building inside his chest. Dong-hyun was embarrassed and angry, but uninjured. His uniform was ruined, and he had lost the water he had been carrying, but his pride was hurt worse than his body. Hyunwoo could see the shame and frustration in his subordinates' eyes. Captain So-young and Lieutenant Mina moved to stand beside their commander in a show of solidarity that was not lost on the watching aliens. Dr. Yoon-ji joined them, along with Lieutenant Ji-hoon and the other human officers. What had been scattered individuals was becoming a united group bound together by shared anger and wounded pride. The aliens seemed to find this gathering amusing rather than concerning. Captain Zekmore made another comment about pack behavior in primitive species and suggested that perhaps humans were more like herd animals than actual warriors. His casual arrogance was complete and absolute as he looked down at the group of humans who barely reached his chest, even when standing at full height. Then the alien captain made the mistake that would change everything. He walked directly toward Commander Hyunwoo with the confident stride of someone who had never lost a fight and never expected to face a real challenge. His 4 arms swung loosely at his sides, and his expression showed nothing but contempt for the small human who was supposed to be some kind of leader. When Zekmore reached Hyunwoo, he loomed over the human commander, using his massive size to intimidate and dominate. His 4 eyes looked down with obvious disdain as he spoke in a voice loud enough for every human and alien present to hear clearly. The translation device rendered his words as a direct challenge to Hyunwoo's authority and capability as a military leader. The alien captain questioned how someone so small and weak could possibly command the respect of other warriors. He suggested that human military ranks were probably just for show, since real combat required actual strength and size, rather than whatever pathetic skills these primitive beings might have developed on their backward planet. Before Hyunwoo could respond, Captain Zekmore raised one of his massive hands and brought it across the human commander's face in a casual, dismissive slap that echoed across the entire training area like a gunshot. The blow was delivered with just enough force to be insulting without causing serious injury, but the message was unmistakable. Humans were inferior beings who existed for the amusement of their betters. The silence that followed was complete and terrible. Every human present felt that slap as if it had landed on their own face. Years of military discipline and diplomatic necessity warred with the fundamental human response to such deliberate humiliation. Hyunwoo's head had snapped to the side from the force of the blow, and a thin line of blood appeared at the corner of his mouth. For a moment that seemed to last forever. Nobody moved or spoke. Then Commander Hyunwoo slowly turned his head back to face the alien who had just made the greatest mistake of his very long military career. The expression in the human's eyes was no longer diplomatic or professional. It was the cold, calculating look of a predator who had just identified his prey and was preparing to strike. Time seemed to slow down to an impossible crawl as Commander Hyunwoo felt the sting of Captain Zekmore's slap fade from his cheek. The taste of blood in his mouth was sharp and metallic, but it was nothing compared to the fire that was building in his chest. 15 years of Navy SEAL training had taught him to control his emotions and think tactically even in the most extreme situations. Right now, those skills were combining with a lifetime of studying combat and warfare to create something dangerous. The first second after the slap, Hyun-woo did not move at all. To everyone watching it looked like he might be stunned or afraid. Captain Zekmore certainly thought so because his 4 eyes showed satisfaction and amusement at having put this small human in his proper place. The other Velkari soldiers were already starting to make their grinding laughter sounds in anticipation of whatever humiliation would come next. But inside that motionless exterior, Hyun-woo's mind was working faster than it ever had before. His eyes were cataloging every detail of the alien captain's stance and position. Zekmore was standing with his weight slightly forward, showing confidence and dominance. His forearms were relaxed and hanging loose because he did not expect any real threat from such a small opponent. More importantly, the alien was wearing his combat armor, but Hyun-woo had been studying that armor all day. He had noticed that while it covered most of the body, there were joints and connection points that had to remain flexible for movement. The throat area was protected by overlapping plates, but there was a small gap just above the chest piece that would be vulnerable to a precise strike. Zekmore's biology was different from human biology, but certain principles of leverage and pressure points would still apply. The alien had 4 arms, but they all connected to the same torso, which meant the same nerve clusters and blood vessels that humans relied on would exist in similar locations. His greater size and strength were advantages, but they also made him slower to react and change direction. All of these observations and calculations happened in the space of 1 heartbeat, while Hyun-woo stood perfectly still with blood running down from the corner of his mouth. To the watching aliens, he looked defeated and harmless. They had no idea they were looking at one of the most dangerous human beings ever trained in the art of close-quarters combat. The second began when Hyun-woo exploded into motion with a speed that shocked every observer, both human and alien. His right hand came up in a strike that had been practiced thousands of times in training and used dozens of times in real combat situations. The target was that small gap in Zekmore's armor just above the chest piece where alien anatomy would place vulnerable structures that could not be heavily protected. The strike landed with surgical precision and devastating effect. Zekmore's confident expression changed instantly to surprise and then to pain as his breathing was suddenly disrupted. The alien captain staggered backward, making choking sounds while his 4 hands moved reflexively to his throat. He had never experienced an attack that targeted such a specific vulnerability with such accuracy. But Hyun-woo was not finished. While the alien was still reacting to the throat strike, the human commander grabbed one of Zekmore's 4 wrists with both hands. The alien's arm was massive and heavily muscled, but Hyun-woo was not trying to overpower it through strength. Instead, he was using principles of leverage and momentum that had been developed by human warriors over thousands of years of fighting. The key was to use the opponent's own size and weight against them. Zekmore was much larger and heavier than Hyun-woo, but that mass became a disadvantage when it was suddenly moving in an uncontrolled direction. The human commander stepped to the side and pulled on the alien's arm while using his hip as a fulcrum point to redirect all that weight and momentum. Captain Zekmore found himself flying through the air in a direction he had not intended to go. His 4 arms flailed uselessly as he tried to regain control, but the laws of physics were working against him. 8 feet of height and 400 pounds of muscle and armor crashed to the ground with an impact that shook the entire training area and left a crack in the concrete where he landed. The 3rd second found Commander Hyun-woo kneeling beside the fallen alien captain, with his knee pressed firmly against Zekmore's throat and his right hand positioned to deliver a killing strike to the same vulnerable point he had targeted moments before. The alien's 4 eyes were wide with shock and the beginning of something that looked very much like fear. Every Velkari soldier present stood frozen in complete amazement. Their mighty captain, who had conquered dozens of worlds and defeated hundreds of enemy warriors, was flat on his back, being controlled by a being half his size. The human had moved so fast and with such precision that none of them had been able to follow the individual techniques that led to this impossible result. General Vex Tar took a step forward, but stopped when he saw the expression on Hyun Woo's face. The human commander was completely calm and in control, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he was perfectly willing to kill the alien captain if the situation required it. This was not anger or rage. This was the cold, professional demeanor of someone who had ended lives before and would do so again if necessary. Hyun-woo spoke in a quiet voice that somehow carried clearly to every person in the training area, both human and alien. His tone was respectful but firm as he made his simple demand. He wanted Captain Zekmore to apologize to Sergeant Dong-hyun for the deliberate humiliation he had inflicted earlier. The human commander's knee pressed slightly harder against the alien's throat to emphasize that this was not a request. The watching human soldiers could hardly believe what they were seeing. Their commander had just defeated an opponent who outweighed him by more than 3-1, and was now demanding respect for one of his subordinates. Lieutenant Ji-hoon was grinning, despite the serious nature of the situation. Captain So-young was standing straighter with obvious pride in her commanding. Officer Dr. Yoonji was ready to provide medical assistance if needed, but she was also studying the alien anatomy that was now exposed and vulnerable. Lieutenant Minna was watching the other Velkari soldiers to make sure none of them tried to interfere with what was happening. Every human present understood that this moment was about much more than one fight between two individuals. Captain Zekmore tried to speak, but could only make gasping sounds as Hyun-woo's knee controlled his breathing. His 4 hands were still, moving weakly but not in any coordinated attempt to escape or fight back. The alien warrior, who had been so confident and arrogant moments before, was now completely dependent on the mercy of the small human who held his life in balance. The 3 seconds that changed everything were over, but their effects would ripple out across the galaxy as word spread that humans were not the weak, primitive beings they appeared to be. They were something far more dangerous. They were intelligent warriors who could defeat superior opponents through skill strategy and the kind of courage that refused to accept defeat even when facing impossible odds. The silence stretched on as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Would the human commander show mercy, or would he demonstrate that there were consequences for underestimating Earth's warriors? Either way, Captain Zekmore was about to learn a lesson that no military academy in the galaxy had ever taught, about the true nature of the species from the small blue planet that orbited an unremarkable yellow star. The pressure of Commander Hyun-woo's knee against Captain Zekmore's throat was precise and calculated. Just enough force to restrict the alien's breathing without causing permanent damage, but more than enough to make the massive warrior understand that his life was completely in the human's control. The Velkari captain's 4 eyes were moving frantically as he tried to process how this impossible situation had developed so quickly. Zekmore had fought in hundreds of battles across dozens of worlds during his long military career. He had faced opponents with advanced technology energy weapons and exotic combat techniques that most species could never imagine. But he had never encountered anything like the cold, professional efficiency that this small human had just demonstrated. There was no anger or hatred in the human's actions, just the calm application of lethal skills that had been perfected through years of training and combat experience. The alien captain tried to speak, but could only produce choking gasps as his oxygen supply was carefully controlled by the human kneeling beside him. His 4 hands moved weakly, trying to find some way to escape or fight back. But every movement he made only emphasized how completely he had been defeated. The mighty warrior who had been laughing and bullying human soldiers just minutes before was now helpless and vulnerable. General Vextar and the other Velkari soldiers were still standing frozen in shock, unable to fully comprehend what they were witnessing. Their strongest fighter, their most experienced combat veteran, had been taken, down in 3 seconds by a being they had considered barely worthy of notice. The implications of this defeat were staggering, not just for this mission, but for everything the Velkari thought they knew about warfare and military superiority. The human soldiers were watching with expressions that mixed amazement, pride, and grim satisfaction. They had all felt the sting of alien contempt throughout the day and had been forced to endure insults and humiliation because of diplomatic necessity. Now their commander was showing these arrogant beings from the stars that humans were not weak toys to be pushed around for entertainment. Lieutenant Ji-hoon was studying the alien anatomy that was now exposed and vulnerable, trying to understand how human combat techniques could be so effective against such different physiology. Captain So Young was keeping watch on the other Velkari soldiers, making sure none of them tried to interfere with the lesson their captain was learning. Dr. Yoonji was ready to provide medical assistance, but she was also fascinated by the biological differences and similarities between human and alien bodies. As the seconds passed with no relief from the pressure on his throat, Captain Zekmore began to panic. His breathing was becoming more difficult, and the edges of his vision were starting to darken. The warrior who had conquered worlds and defeated countless enemies was facing the very real possibility that he might die on this primitive planet, at the hands of a being he had considered insignificant. The first signs of real fear appeared in the alien captain's 4 eyes as he realized that Commander Hyun-woo was not going to release him simply because enough time had passed. The human was waiting for something specific, and until he received it, the pressure on the alien's throat would continue. Zekmore tried once again to speak, but could only produce weak, gasping sounds that conveyed desperation rather than words. General Vextar finally found his voice and called out in the Velkari language, commanding Hyun-woo to release their captain. But the human commander did not even look up from his prisoner. He responded in calm English that was picked up by the translation devices, explaining that he would release Captain Zekmore as soon as the alien apologized to Sergeant Dong-hyun for the deliberate humiliation he had inflicted. The concept of a defeated enemy being required to apologize to someone they had wronged was completely foreign to Velkari military culture. In their society, strength determined right, and the weak existed to serve the strong. The idea that a superior warrior should show regret for actions taken against inferior opponents was almost incomprehensible to them. But Captain Zekmore was discovering that incomprehensible concepts became much easier to understand when survival was at stake. His oxygen-starved brain was sending increasingly urgent signals that he needed to do whatever was necessary to make the human release his hold. Pride and military tradition seemed much less important when measured against the basic need to breathe. The alien captain began making urgent gestures with his 4 hands, trying to communicate his willingness to comply with the human's demands. His movements were becoming weaker and less coordinated as the lack of oxygen affected his motor control. The fear in his eyes was now mixed with something that looked very much like pleading as he tried desperately to signal his surrender. Finally, Zekmore managed to produce sounds that the translation device could interpret. His voice was weak and raspy, but the meaning was clear enough. He was asking for mercy and promising to do whatever the human commander required. The mighty warrior who had been dominating human soldiers through size and strength was now reduced to begging for his life. The words came out in a mixture of the Velkari language and broken English as the alien captain tried every method he could think of to communicate his desperate need for the human to show mercy. He promised to apologize to the human soldier he had humiliated. He offered to submit to human authority. He even suggested that perhaps the Velkari had been wrong about human capabilities and needed to reconsider their approach to this first contact situation. But what shocked the watching aliens most was not just that their captain was begging for mercy. It was the tone of genuine fear and respect in his voice as he addressed the small human who controlled his fate. Zekmor was not just asking for his life to be spared. He was acknowledging that he had been wrong about human weakness and was showing the kind of deference that Hyunwoo finally released his hold and stood up, offering his hand to help Zekmor to his feet. The alien warrior was still gasping for air, but he took the offered hand, a gesture that shocked his own people. As he stood, he looked down at Hyunwoo with completely different eyes. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something the Velkari rarely felt toward other species, genuine respect. "I underestimated you," Zekmor said quietly, his voice still rough from being choked. "Your species fights with intelligence, strategy. We use only strength." He turned to Dong-hyun and performed what the humans learned was a Velkari gesture of apology, crossing all four arms over his chest and bowing his head. General Vextar approached Hyunwoo, but this time he didn't tower over the human in an intimidating way. Instead, he stood at a respectful distance. "Commander, we came, here believing we would be recruiting simple soldiers. We see now that we were wrong. Your people fight like—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Like warriors of the mind." Captain So Young stepped forward. "General, we'd be honored to serve alongside the Velkari, but as equals, not as subordinates." The alien general considered this, looking at his own soldiers who were still staring at Zekmor in amazement. Their strongest fighter had been defeated by strategy and skill, not brute force. "Equals," Vextar agreed finally. "Yes, I think that would be wise." He looked around at the assembled humans, Ji-hoon, Tai-min, Yun-ji, and all the others. "We have much to learn from each other. The Federation will be very interested to meet Earth's warriors." As the Velkari prepared to return to their ship, Zekmor approached Hyunwoo one more time. "Commander, would you teach me that technique?" he asked humbly. Hyunwoo smiled, the first real smile he'd shown since the aliens arrived. "Of course. But you'll need to learn patience first. That's the real weapon." From that day forward, humans became known throughout the galaxy not as the small, weak species that needed protection, but as the clever fighters who could defeat opponents twice their size with nothing but skill, courage, and determination. And whenever young Velkari warriors got too proud, their elders would tell them the story of the day Captain Zekmor learned to respect the small humans who fought, with their minds as much as their bodies.